Ben, I can hardly believe it, but we've been teaching this collaborative MA between the National Gallery and King's College London now for 4 years, and focusing specifically on Christianity in the arts, but in particular on the figure of John the Baptist. And I've really enjoyed exploring the National Gallery's collection, and I think at my last count I'm at over 120 figures of John the Baptist. So it just shows his popularity across centuries and in different geographic locations.
And he's a hugely important figure in Christian tradition too, because he's the one who arrives to proclaim the coming of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. He is the forerunner, as he describes himself, preparing the way of the Lord. And in that sense, he's one of the very first saints and one of the very first figures who appears in the New Testament. The Christian Bible is divided into the Old Testament, or Hebrew Bible, which it inherited from Judaism, and the New Testament, which begins to tell the story of Christ. And the life of Christ particularly concentrated in the 4 Gospels within the New Testament. And John the Baptist is one of the very first characters to appear in the Gospel narratives, precisely because he's the forerunner. And yet, he also looks back to that tradition of prophets in the Old Testament.
In that way, he sort of represents both continuity and change, doesn't he? And I think that's captured very beautifully in Carlo Crivelli's 15th century altarpiece that we're looking at. And if you have a look at here, John the Baptist is represented on the left. And what I'm struck by in particular is that the way that he stands on one particular ground, which, as you see, is at the banks of a river, and how that marks a disruption between the other saints of the same altarpiece who stand on these very elaborate marble parapets. So he's both part of this gathering of saints and set apart.
He always stands out, it seems to me, as quite unlike any other saint, so distinctive. I mean, you can see any number of bishop saints and you have to work quite hard to work out which it is, or monk saints, or the saints of virgin martyrs. The Baptist you could never mistake for anyone other than himself.
And I think that's something that artists have picked up on. They wanted representations of their saints to be immediately recognizable, not least perhaps from the back of a church, from the congregation who couldn't get up close. But actually, if we do get up close and have a little look at this altarpiece, I can show you a few of the details. The Baptist, because of all the time he spent in the desert, he's often represented as quite thin and emaciated with long, wavy hair. But possibly the most recognizable attribute is he wears this extraordinary camel skin, which he is said to have clothed himself in. But there's a few other attributes that we have in the Crivelli that literally point our way forward to different aspects of his life, namely that pointing gesture, which you'll see repeated over and over in representations of John.
It's the perfect symbol for his whole preparatory ministry. He's a pointer. He's pointing to Christ. That's his job as a saint. And here it's wonderfully achieved by the fact that he's pointing to words that refer to Christ on his scroll. The Latin words ecce agnus Dei, which mean behold the Lamb of God. The Lamb of God was John's description of Christ, the one who would die to take away the sins of the world. And those are really important words for Christians through the centuries too, because they're uttered in the context of the Mass or the Eucharist. It's as if some of the Baptist's most important words are immortalized in the regular worship of Christians at the point where the bread and wine are consecrated and represent the presence of Christ among the congregation.
Of course, John often carries a reed cross in allusion to Christ's crucifixion, but the fact that it's made from reeds refers back to his time by the River Jordan. That's where John the Baptist did his baptizing. And this representation of the water in the foreground of this panel represents that very river. And interestingly, Crivelli's included this little riverbank on our side, on the viewer's side of the painting, so that he's situating us on the banks of the River Jordan, facing John.
That's wonderful. It really brings us into the picture, not only into the presence of John, but into the idea of baptism itself, as if we could step into the water and be baptized by him ourselves.
Almost an invitation. And most often, John is represented in the act of baptizing Christ. And we're very lucky at the National Gallery because we have one of the most famous representations of that baptism by Piero della Francesca. I'll show it to you. The Piero della Francesca baptism was painted about just over 20 years before the Crivelli. And it was also an altarpiece for a church in Piero's native city called Borgo San Sepolcro in Tuscany. And it must have been for an altar dedicated to John the Baptist to have this as such a prominent feature at the center of the altarpiece. And you see, even from here, look how it sort of pulls you towards it. Here in Piero's baptism altarpiece, we see probably the most represented scene in the life of John the Baptist. When we don't have him represented singly, as we did in the Carlo Crivelli altarpiece, this would be the key moment. This is the culminating moment, if you will, of John's life, isn't it?
He's been baptizing others until this point, but at this point Christ arrives to receive John's baptism, and that's both the crowning point of John the Baptist's career, why we call him John the Baptist.
Precisely.
And also the beginning of Christ's public ministry. So it's a crucial turning point for both of them.
And it's quite interesting too. This is the moment where actually Christ is the central figure. His ministry begins, he becomes more and more important, and John's lesser so, but always, I mean, as we will see in every moment, John is always that step ahead. He's preparing the way for Christ.
That's fascinating, because he's a preparer and a precursor at every point. He's just one step ahead, as you say, of Christ. In terms of the first to have a miraculous birth, the first to preach, the first to baptize. Uniquely, apart from Christ, we have his whole life told within the New Testament from beginning to end, and not even the Virgin Mary has that privilege.
It's perhaps why he's been such an important focus for artists and patrons who represent every scene, every episode from his life. And what we'll do in the next 9 episodes is actually examine National Gallery pictures which represent key moments from his life from beginning to end, and maybe explore why he was so important for so many different people over the centuries.